Now it's the category of what attracts your attention. Now Jung was very interested in this. He thought that what attracted your attention was a consequence of the manifestation of the higher self. The self is what he called it. The self is what you are. The ego is what you think you are. And it might also, that's close enough. The self is what you actually are. Well, you have no idea what you actually are because you don't know very much about yourself, and you're really, 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 really complicated. And there's lots of things going on that you have no idea about, and the world is a really strange place. And the self is also the thing that you are now, and the thing that you were, and all of the things that you could potentially become. And that's a strange idea. So maybe you guys can help me think about this, because I've been thinking for a long time about these sorts of things. So there's that. You might say, well, is the unknown, is that a reasonable representation of the unknown as such? The unknown as such is the place from which matter and spirit emerges. Okay, now, you think, well, no, I'm saying that's the best definition of reality. That's the best definition, or we're gonna make that proposition. You say, well, no, that's not right. The best definition of reality is material reality. Material reality, you can decompose it down to the elemental and the atomic level, and that's objective reality, and everything else is a secondary manifestation of that. And that's the modern worldview. Although we don't and can't factor consciousness into that. But whatever. It's a pretty powerful view. It's enabled us to get a lot of places. So then if you're going to offer a counterposition, and by the way, although it took me probably 30 years to figure this out, there are many other people who have made this case. So Heidegger, for example, made the case that I'm making, and Jung made the case that I'm making, although I knew that. So other people have wandered down this path, fundamentally. So it's not as idiosyncratic, as strange as you might think. What do you see, what is it that you are facing when you face the future? Now there's a variety of ways of thinking about that, but let's think about how you act and how you think when you think about confronting the future. I would say, well, you see the future as a field of possibilities, right? You do, that's what you do. You see the future as a field of possibilities. And you use your faculty of imagination to map potential routes through that sea of potentiality. Because you imagine that you could be A, or you could be B, you could be a plumber, you could be a lawyer, you could be a supermodel, you could be a nerd. Like there's all of these possibilities that lie open to you. And some of them are more at hand than others. In that you could get from here to there very rapidly. So for example, if you wanted to go get a drink of water in the next 10 seconds, you could probably make that reality manifest itself. But if you wanted to be a billionaire, then it's going to take a fair bit of maneuvering to make that reality manifest itself. So some are there and some are far. But you act as if what you're up against is possibility. And then what you also act out is that you're the thing that can transform itself in response to the transformations of that possibility. And everyone believes that, even though they don't notice it. And so your parents say, live up to your potential. What in the world is that? Your potential. Now, it's weird. It seems to me it's weird. Like, it's hard to measure. I mean, if I gave you guys an IQ test, that would be some clunky way of measuring part of your potential. But it's not even easy for us to measure potential. And then you think, well, what is the stuff that we call potential? It's not the way things are, it's the way they could be. And it seems to be that they could be a whole bunch of ways, not just one. And so, what seems to happen is that this field of potential collapses into a single actuality as we interact with it. Now, I should also point out that there are models propagated mostly by John Wheeler in his school. He's a quantum physicist. And his hypothesis, he calls his hypothesis it from bit, bit being a piece of information. He believes that the ground of reality is basically something that's best conceptualized as information. And that when consciousness interacts with it, whatever consciousness happens to be, it transforms itself from potential to actuality. It snaps into place. And there's weird corollaries to this. So here's a bloody weird thing. This is from Wheeler. So let's say you go outside and you look at a distant galaxy. It's maybe, who knows how far it is away. It doesn't really matter. 3 million light years away. You look at it, a photon hits your retina. Wheeler claims that that photon couldn't have left that star 30 million years ago unless your eye was there now to perceive it. Now that's a bloody weird thing to say. And if you don't believe me, you can look it up. I mean, I wouldn't say something like that unless I was reasonably sure that that is in fact what he would say. Wheeler believes that the quantum waveform, which is, I think it's something like this horizon of potentials, doesn't become realized until it's interacted with by something that's conscious. Now, not everybody believes Wheeler, but the physicists who don't believe Wheeler believe something that's even weirder. They believe that every time a quantum event, so if you go down far enough into the subatomic realm, you get to events that are no longer divisible, basically. So a quantum event, for example, would be the bouncing of an electron from one shell, atomic shell, to a lower shell, in which case, if I remember correctly, it emits a photon. So the bounce is a quantum event. The electron goes from here to here, but it doesn't pass through the intervening space, however that happens, and then it releases a photon. And the photon is a quantum event. And so things are quantum because at some point you can't break them down any further. So your computer screen is quantized, right? Because if you get the resolution up high enough, you can see the singular pixels that it's made out of, and that's it. You can't go any farther than that. So these other physicists believe that every time there's a quantum event that could go one way or could go another, that a new universe is created in which if it goes one way here, it goes the other way in that new universe. And so there's like infinite numbers of infinitely branching universes. And you might say, well, where are those? And the answer is they don't know. They can't really detect them in some sense. And then you might say, well, that's a hell of a theory to explain something simple by. All you do is posit an infinite number of infinite universes and poof, you solved your problem. It's hardly an Occam's razor solution. And then you might say, well, why even bother with that theory? And part of the answer is, well, there are people that are working very hard on quantum computation. And quantum computation involves the use of these things that I don't comprehend at all, called qubits. Q-U-B-I-T-S. And a qubit is a state of matter that could be a variety of different states, but isn't any of those yet. And you can use those qubits to compute. But the simplest way of saying what you're doing when you're doing quantum computation is that you're using the universes that are pretty close to ours to do your computations in, so that you can get a lot more done in a lot shorter time because you're doing some things in this universe and you're doing some other things in a bunch of other universes, and so that's a lot more efficient. And you might think, well, sure, but quantum computation does work. Now, there's even a company that has manufactured what they claim is a quantum computer, although you can do quantum computations at very local levels. That's been demonstrated. No one doubts it. It's published in journals like Science and Nature. This actually happens. There's a company that claims that they've produced a commercial quantum computer, and people aren't sure if that's true or not, for reasons I don't understand, but the computer is capable of doing certain kinds of calculations much faster than a normal computer can. So, that's all pretty damn weird. That's for sure. Now, it seems to me, and I wrote a paper with my graduate students about this, and we were stretching our knowledge to right to the end of our limits. We were trying to unite the theory of anxiety with thermodynamics, basically. And we published this paper in a journal called Psych Review, which is a very good journal. It's very hard to publish in Psych Review. It's the only paper I've ever published there. And we basically proposed that when you get anxious, what you see in front of you, what you perceive in front of you, you can't actually see it with your eyes. It's more like you perceive it with your body, or your body perceives it. what you see unfolding in front of you is a large and indeterminate space of potential worlds, roughly speaking. And that the reason you get anxious is because all of a sudden there's all those potential worlds you have to deal with. And you didn't think that you were going to have to deal with any of them. So you might say, well, when does that happen to you? And I would say, okay, so it's 20 below, and you're late for class, and you jump in your car, and it's snowing like mad, and you drive 2 miles, and all of a sudden your car stops. And then you might say, well, what is it that you're sitting in now? And you will say, well, obviously I'm sitting in a car. It's like, that's by no means obvious that what you're sitting in is now a car. It could be a tomb if it's cold enough. And even if it's not a tomb, you're not where you expected to be, you're not where you want to be, and it isn't exactly clear where you are. And so that your body is going to get all, I just saw a dinosaur-like. And it's an apprehension. It's a perception. It's a perception that the map that you were using to map your environment, to define all the objects and to define your relationship to those objects, no longer fits the territory. And so then you might say, well, if your map doesn't fit the territory, then what the hell is the territory? And the answer to that is many things, many of which you cannot control. Now, you might get lucky, and all that has to happen is that somebody comes and tows you along and takes you to a mechanic. But even that's going to rattle your chains because, well, if your car breaks down, how do you feel about having to take it to a mechanic? Well, mostly you don't feel good about it. And why? It's like, well, you don't know if the mechanic will find the damn problem. You don't know if you might have to get a new car. You don't know if you can trust the mechanic to tell you whether you need a new car. Maybe it's a $2 part and he offers to put a whole new motor in. Then you have to deal with him. You have to find a place to take it. You have to assess whether or not the shop is honest. So it's like a whole can of snakes, and part of that can of snakes is, is it the case that the mechanic to whom I take this car is the thing that he presents himself as? Now, in an honest transaction, that problem never comes up because you just assume that the person in front of you is two-dimensional and that you can assume that they're identical with what they say, right? That's an honest transaction. So then you're not dealing with a can of snakes, you're dealing with a few words. But if it's not an honest transaction, it's like, whoop, can of snakes. So, and maybe someone stops to help you on the side of the road. And you think, well, is that a good thing? Or is that a bad thing? Because the person who's approaching you in the snowstorm when it's isolated is also a can of snakes. And then there's the other snakes that come out, like, well, you aren't going to get to class, and so maybe you have an exam, and so then there's the whole, well, what happens if I miss this exam, and maybe that'll, I won't do so well in this course, and then I have to go talk to the professor, and it's going to be a big mess, etc. And so I would say that what happens when your car stops on the way to school is that everything around you turns into a mass of snakes. Now, obviously that's a symbol, right? Because they're not real snakes. But they're not your damn car either. And you might, to the degree that you confuse what you're sitting in with a car, all you're going to be is irritated and upset because it's going to manifest none of the features of a car. Because a car isn't a block of metal with 4 tires on it. A car is something you can ignore while it takes you from point A to point B. And as soon as it isn't doing that, it isn't a car. It's some bloody chunk of metal with all sorts of parts that you don't understand, that a bunch of people you don't know anything about are going to have to manipulate before it will turn back into a car at your expense.